Ladies and gentlemen, our program will begin in just a moment. Ladies and gentlemen, our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Today's program is brought to you in partnership with Jewish Insider. You can sign up for Jewish Insider's daily kickoff by visiting jewishinsider.com. Joining us today is AJC CEO David Harris. Described by the late Israeli President Shimon Peres as the foreign minister of the Jewish people, David Harris has led AJC since 1990. For 40 years, David has been a leading advocate for strengthening Israel's place in the world, for deepening ties with key countries, and for advancing Israel's quest for enduring peace and security. Today, David will discuss the tough questions, complex issues, and new opportunities facing the pro-Israel world. Moderating this conversation is David Harris's Chief of Staff, Bel Yoeli. After we hear from David, we will take your questions. You may email your questions to questions@ajc.org. Questions is plural. Bel, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Jillian. Welcome to our audience. And David, as always, it's great to be with you. The subjects of Israel and pro-Israel advocacy, I know, David, are near and dear to your heart, and of course, central to the work that we at AJC do. And we have a lot to cover, so I'm just going to jump right in with our questions. First and foremost, to start us off, David, when and why did you first become an advocate for Israel? Was there something in particular going on in your life at the time or in the world, and what inspired you to take action?
So I don't think there was any particular moment. There was not a kind of aha moment in my life, Bel, but it was an evolution. I realize now, looking back, I grew up in a home, as I've said on another occasion, that was not particularly Jewish in the sense of observance or ritual or membership, but it was a home that was pro-Israel. My family lived in Israel, several members of my family. My uncle, Jules Chender, had been involved in smuggling weapons to then Palestine from the United States. In fact, had been detained by the FBI for his involvement in that effort. So it was really in the air that I breathed. And then I read the book Exodus when I was probably 14 or so. And again, as I've said on another occasion, Bel, it's the first all-nighter I ever pulled. I was completely captivated by the story. And then probably at the age of 20 or 21, I made my first trip to Israel. And for me, it was exciting to go to Israel, but it was also exciting to go to many other countries as well in Europe. But I remembered sort of arriving in Israel and realizing that this was something different. It had a profound impact on me. Everything I saw, the energy, the vitality. And then as I began to sort of get older and step back, I realized, the reemergence of Israel on the global stage is a big deal. Historically, it's a very big deal. You have to go back to 70 in the Common Era, the year 70, and the destruction of the Second Temple, to realize that for not quite 1900 years, there was no Jewish state. I was taught that at 25 years represents a generation. So you're talking about more than 75 generations of Jews from the first century in the Common Era until the rebirth of the State of Israel, who kept Israel, Jerusalem, Zion, in their prayers, in their thoughts, at their Passover Seder. And you know what? Here, I was part of the generation, call it the 76th generation, that actually didn't just talk about next year or some distant dream or some beautifully worded psalm. It was here. I was one of the lucky ones. And whether I chose to live in Israel or not, it was a reality. So the power of those big thoughts, of this historical moment, eventually enveloped me. And I just found myself slowly, showing up here or there for a rally, or maybe dropping a letter to a member of Congress. But it was a process rather than a moment.
David, you've said it before, and the way you just spoke about it now, you've described Israel as the rebirth of Israel as a miracle. And as you said, I think a lot of us take Israel's existence for granted. In your mind, why does it seem that not enough people share this view of Israel as a miracle, and are often seeing Israel from a more negative light in terms of the global scale? Why is this the case, and why does it seem to be the internal struggle for Israel?
I wish I knew the answer, Belle, because if we did, we'd be on the road to some great successes. Look, I think for many, it begins in the family. I spoke about my own family, but every family is its own family story. Some had relatives in Palestine, then Israel, others did not. Some made it a priority to visit Israel. Others made it a priority to visit Europe or resorts in the Caribbean, but not Israel. Some were immensely proud of the rebirth of Jewish sovereignty. Others felt perhaps squeamish or uncomfortable with the notion of a Jewish state. So there are lots and lots of reasons, I'm sure, and I've only scratched the surface, Belle, that explains what I would have thought would have been a universal reaction of wonder and excitement, and a sense of the moment that this state was being reborn. And as others, including Winston Churchill, have said, this was a moment in history to be seen not through the prism of, I think he said, decades or centuries even, but through the prism of 1,000, 2,000, even 3,000 years of world history. That's the way I came to understand it. And I only wish that more people would understand that as well. Sure, we'll get into the daily political issues, the agreements, the disagreements, the pulls, the tensions, the tugs. But my point is, as a pro-Israel advocate, what I hope the audience will take away from this conversation is the overarching framework. The overarching framework, again, is I believe that we are among the luckiest Jews in the history that transcends well over 3,000 years. We are here on our watch in our lifetimes and witnessing now the 8th decade of Israel's renewed sovereignty. It's a very, very exciting story.
So David, putting those pieces together, right, the framework and the approach that you mentioned, there is a 50,000 foot level perspective and some of the challenges and the opportunities for Israel. How do you and AJC more broadly approach pro-Israel advocacy, and what are the different aspects of that work?
So first of all, I need to add one other piece to the conversation we've had until now about what drew me in was, so again, the realization of a distant dream, a persistent but distant dream that Israel would be reborn, that L'Shana Haba'ah Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem, may remain a metaphysical concept, but realistically, it could be today and tomorrow and Friday in Jerusalem. But there was a second piece that drew me in, and I think helps explain both my and AJC's involvement, and that is that the threats to Israel continue to exist. There are those who want to divide, this kind of approach generationally, as if to say, well, sure, for David's generation, there was the Holocaust, there was the 48 war, there was the 67 war, there was the 73 war. So that generation is defined by the threat, by the fear. But we, other generations, younger generations, don't live with that mindset. I wish that this were generational. And that was the only explanation for it, that there was no other explanation for it. But there is another explanation for it. It's not about generations and younger people versus older people or the degree of proximity to the Holocaust. It's the fact that in 1948, on day one, literally day one, The state was announced on May 14th, 1948. By May 15th, 1948, 5 standing Arab armies launched a war which had only one goal. It was a declared goal. It was a stated goal, the annihilation of this embryonic state. That's it. But today, that threat has not entirely disappeared. Much has changed, though. I want to be absolutely clear. Lots, amazing things have changed. Example, in 1948, there were roughly 650,000 Jews in what was called the Yishuv, the Jewish community of then British Mandatory Palestine. Today, that number is 10 times what it was 72 years ago, and the state itself has over 9 million citizens. Astonishing. Not only it is a democratic state with elections galore, as we know from the last year and a half alone, smooth transfers of power, civilian control over the military, an economy that grew from what my grandparents would have said, gornisht mit gornisht, nothing and nothing. No natural resources, a beleaguered population that had to defend itself from day one. The per capita income in Israel today puts it well into the middle to upper ranks of the European Union. Israel today is a member of the OECD, the most advanced countries in the world. On the happiness index, Israel ranks among the happiest countries in the world. On the power index, Israel ranks among the most powerful nations on earth. I mean, by every measure, this country is an extraordinary success, not to mention its ability to defend itself. And yet, there are those who still wish to destroy it. And forgive me, it's not generational. It's simply a matter of reading what Iranian leaders say and believing it. Reading what Hamas and Hezbollah and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and ISIS and Al-Qaeda leaders have to say and taking them at their word. And it's taking at their word their enablers, their supporters, their boosters around the world who want to this day to question the very legitimacy of the state of Israel, its very right to exist, its very right to defend itself, who treat Israel differently at the United Nations than any other nation on earth. I wish I could say the battle were over. I wish I could become like an Italian American whose whole relationship to Italy is based on the love of the country, occasional visits, a love of the cuisine, a love of the language. Yes, I share all of that vis-a-vis Israel, but the Italian Americans and the equivalent of AJC do not spend their time worrying about threats to the existence of Italy. Italy is not living in fear of being overrun by neighbors tomorrow. In the case of Israel, that has not gone away. And that too becomes an essential element, therefore, of the advocacy.
David, I'm very glad you added that important context, because it makes explaining AJC and our approach to this, it gives us a fuller picture, right? Because on the one hand, we have, as you said, Israel as this strong, amazing force, and we have these multiple continued threats, which you're exactly right, not that you need the validation, but my generation and those of us who support Israel feel that very deeply. So given that broad context and these serious challenges and opportunities, how do you and AJC work and approach Israel advocacy?
We approach it in several ways. Number one, I think to anyone who knows AJC, this is a consistent high priority for the American Jewish Committee. We operate globally. We operate on every continent. We operate across the United States. And wherever we operate, pro-Israel advocacy is an essential part of our agenda. So that's number one. Number two, we approach this independently, meaning we don't reflect a political party, neither in the United States nor in Israel. We don't reflect a particular ideology or dogma or doctrine that many other groups, especially here in the United States, do. We try and take facts as we see them, and the facts in turn shape how we view Israel, the U.S.-Israel relationship, and Israel's place in the world. My big question about ideologically driven organizations in the Jewish world, including right here in the United States, are what to me seems like a reverse process, which is to make sure that the facts as they see them fit into the ideology. And if they don't fit into the ideology, to find a whole array of rationales, excuses, pretexts for blocking out that information. You know, in a way, it's like the phenomenon that we call bias confirmation. And it can be about buying a car or buying a house or picking a side in politics or in diplomacy, you know, where you basically don't want to hear whatever may challenge your orthodoxy, whether it's right-wing orthodoxy or left-wing orthodoxy. You don't want to hear it because it unsettles the airtight thinking within that orthodoxy, within that bubble. Better to live comfortably within that bubble than uncomfortably, as we at AJC do, by seeing the nuance, by seeing the fact that there can be more than one way to approach these issues, by understanding that after 72 years, Bill, there is no one on the planet who has a monopoly of wisdom on how to ensure peace for Israel. And by the way, when I say peace, I don't just mean peace. I mean serious, enduring, comprehensive peace. And when I look at the ideologically driven organizations, not only do they have this airtight thinking as I see it, they have an arrogance that comes with it. An arrogance that essentially says, we know how to get there. Well, thank you. But for 72 years, an awful lot of smart people with names like David Ben-Gurion and Golda Meir and Abba Eban and go down the list, have wanted peace for Israel no less than those of us in America want peace for Israel. The Jews did not return to Israel to live in permanent conflict. They lived to finally establish one tiny piece of land, 2/3 the size of mighty Belgium. Roughly the equivalent, I think, of Wales and the equivalent of New Jersey. Just one little sliver of land. And to establish sovereignty, where they were not dependent on the goodwill of the majority. That's it. They did not go in order to be in permanent conflict and to see first themselves and then their children and then their grandchildren and now their great-grandchildren having to serve in the IDF on life and death issues. So this notion of arrogance, the arrogance of the right that says nothing will ever change, we have to live in Masada, you can never trust anyone in Israel's neighbors, say no, just build the walls and keep them out. Or the arrogance of the left that says peace is around the corner, but for Israel's unwillingness to pursue peace. Give me a break. I mean, I don't have to take this at the 30,000-foot level, Bill. My wife and I have enough family in Israel. Very close family. I mean, siblings and nieces and nephews and daughters-in-law to understand that there is no Israeli we know that wants to continue the status quo. But peace has to be real peace. It can't be a piece of paper. It can't be a facade of Potemkin village. And that's where AJC separates itself from these organizations. We don't have the certitude. We don't have the arrogance to believe that we know. And the last thing, in terms of what distinguishes us, is, I think, a certain humility. The humility that says, you know, at the end of the day, we had a choice. Each of us, all of us, Bill, you, me, the people watching, we had a choice to go and live in Israel. Put aside the pandemic, I wish we could. You know, here in New York, how many? 5, 6, 7 flights a day, nonstop to Tel Aviv? From how many other gateway cities in the United States? We made a conscious choice, however, for whatever reasons, I'm not questioning the reasons, to choose to live our lives here. Shouldn't that give us a certain humility? When a sovereign, mature state of now 9 million people, a member of the OECD, that has managed for 72 years to build an extraordinary country, Shouldn't we have a certain humility about how much we seek to impose our views? By the way, even going to the United States Congress, to individual legislators, to officials, and trying to determine their views on Israel in ways that could be potentially damaging or deleterious, all in the arrogant notion that we know better, or to use that famous phrase, to save Israel from itself. That's where AJC parts company. We have an office in Jerusalem. It's staffed by Israelis. Each of them and their families have served in the IDF. They pay the taxes. They run the risks. They put their children on school buses. They have to go into their shelters in 15 seconds if the missiles come from Gaza. No, it doesn't mean we have to keep silent, but to us at AJC, it means we have to keep in mind the distribution of risk here. And if we get it wrong, who pays the price? Not those of us who live in New York or San Francisco or Miami or Houston. The people who get it wrong are the people in Ashdod and in Beersheba and in Ashkelon and Sderot and on the northern border. So independence, humility, and nonpartisanship.
David, I still want to tease out of you some frontline war stories, but since you touched on this, this point of the role of Jewish organizations, I want to ask you, you hinted at this. I've heard you speak about kind of the idea of faithcraft versus statecraft as two imperatives when thinking about, within the Jewish world, especially when thinking about Israel. Can you elaborate on this concept based on what you just said?
Sure. Look, if I go to synagogue here in the US, it's often a very exhilarating feeling. I, in particular, I'm just speaking for myself. I mean, I'm very moved when we sing Oseh Shalom. I'm very powerfully inspired when we sing Hinei Matov. When, especially during the Chagim, the high holidays, we sing Lo Yisagoy El Goy Cherev, nation shall not lift up sword against nation. When we hear the psalmists, the prophets invoked, Tzedek, Tzedek Tirdof, justice, justice shall not pursue. It gives me enormous pride. It steers me. It's my kind of moral GPS. That's the faithcraft, at least as I choose to interpret our faith. But our faith, as I interpret it, rests on a three-legged stool. The faith itself, that is the religious teachings, the spiritual heritage, if you will, is one leg of the stool. The second leg of the stool is the land. And the third leg of the stool is the people. That, for me, is the three-legged stool of Jewish identity. If you remove any one of those three legs, Bell, the stool no longer works. The land is more or less, I'm not drawing from biblical times, but is more or less what we call Israel today. Israel as a land and Israelis as part of the Jewish people have to practice not only faithcraft, but statecraft. It would be wonderful to be able to say the two are identical. It would make me the happiest person on the planet. I could die a satisfied person if the two could be conflated into one. That it were all about translating the welcome the stranger, pursue justice, nation shall not lift up sword against nation, walk humbly before thy God, as the statecraft. The problem is that the statecraft cannot be practiced as faithcraft alone in a region like the Middle East, where some countries are still at war with Israel. Syria is technically still at war with Israel, where Iran casts its long shadow, both directly from Tehran and through its proxies, and where the terrorist infrastructure in Gaza, for example, rather than building Gaza into a new Singapore and showing the world what can be accomplished through peace, would rather seek Israel's destruction. That's where the statecraft comes in. And when statecraft comes in, Bell, the ethical and moral questions cannot be put into a drawer. Don't misunderstand me. But they have to coexist with, unfortunately, the nitty-gritty realities of how a nation survives. And by the way, it's not just Israel. You name the democracy. Even the democracies like Italy that don't face the existential challenge. And I will share with you from my own diplomatic history and war stories, how many times those nations have compromised on their high-minded democratic principles. And by the way, I'm not now singling out Italy or any one country, but the gamut of democratic countries, how many times they've sacrificed those principles in the interests of what? In the interests of importing energy, in the interests of multilateral politics at the United Nations or elsewhere, in the interests of markets, in the interest of political intimidation from other parts of the world. I wish I could say that statecraft, even practiced by the best, most transparent countries in the world, was totally aligned with a moral code, whether it's a Jewish moral code or a universal moral code or both. We like to think ours is a universal moral code. But in Israel, it's even more complicated because, again, of the realities it has to face. So you just take one obvious example among thousands, Bell. And here, ironically, despite all the accusations against Israel, Israel's enemies, beginning with those in the region, understand what Israel's Achilles heel actually is. This is one of the ironies of the whole story. For all their accusations against Israel at the United Nations or the International Criminal Court or in the media or elsewhere, they understand what Israel's Achilles heel is. What is that? Its moral code, including the moral code of the IDF. They know that if terrorist A is moving from point Y to point Z in Gaza, and terrorist A is alone, that Israel's intelligence might identify him and take him out. They also know, however, if terrorist A surrounds himself in a car by innocent people, spouse, children, others who are not identified, that Israel, the IDF, is going to think twice and 3 and 4 times, and in just about every case that I'm aware of, will abort the mission. Even as they know that terrorist A may be plotting an attack at that very time. But Israel will make that excruciatingly difficult decision. You know what? We are not, as a matter of policy. There are always accidents in war. Always accidents. There are accidents in the American bombing of Germany in the Second World War, in the British bombing of Germany. There are always going to be accidents, unintended consequences, or maybe in some cases even intended, in the case of Allied bombing of the Nazis. But Israel is going to think twice. So there are always going to be these difficult moral decisions, Bell. That's the essence of statecraft. That's unavoidable. The alternative is essentially to say, Israel, we want you to live only by the Jewish prophetic code, which would be wonderful. I hope one day that will be the case. But those who say it today have no understanding of the reality, or their intentions may be a little less benign.
Thank you, David, for sharing that. I think it explains a lot that often too many of us misunderstand or don't think about when discussing these issues. I want to pivot towards current events and what's on the horizon. But before I do, I have to ask you, I know we could talk about this for hours, but is there one example of Israel advocacy that really stands out for you in terms of being on the front lines, where it was a particularly challenging moment, or you saw someone's high-level official that you meet with all the time, you saw their mind change or pivot? To me, one moment that stands out that was particularly tense for all of us was the JCPOA in 2015, the Iranian nuclear deal. So I know that was a lot in there, but perhaps you could highlight one particular moment that really stands out for you as part of this work.
Sure. Well, I'll give you a war story, since you, I think, mentioned war story in passing earlier. I'll do that here, Bell, and I hope we can come back to the Iran nuclear deal, because I think it also speaks to some of the things I tried to explain earlier. So, without naming the country, but it was in Europe, a couple of years ago, we had a meeting scheduled with the Prime Minister, so the head of the government of this country. And we arrived about 20 minutes before the scheduled meeting in order to be polite. And we're in the waiting room. And the chief of staff to the Prime Minister comes in, and he says to me, David, look, the Prime Minister is an honorable person. He's going to keep the meeting that he has with AJC. But I just need you to know that he has come off an all-night meeting on the budget. We are in big trouble economically. We have to cut. It's going to trigger protests on the streets. He's going to be the target of those protests. There could be a vote of no confidence in the parliament. So you're not exactly catching him at a great time. So I'm saying to myself, trying to draw on these years and years of thousands of meetings around the world, what do we do? Because this was still a relatively new situation, though. And sure enough, we ushered into the meeting were probably 4 or 5 AJC members. And I can see the Prime Minister, he hasn't shaved. He hasn't gone home yet from the all-nighter. And I'm reading into his face something along the lines of, who was the idiot staff member who scheduled this meeting? Why am I meeting with this group right now? My government may be collapsing. There may be street protests any minute. I don't know what my future is. And I've got this group from the American Jewish Committee that wants to talk to me and probably make some case for why anti-Semitism is bad or whatever it may be. So this is the way I read the situation. He didn't say it, but this was the way I read the situation. So I pivoted. Instead of whatever we were planning to speak, I ad-libbed entirely. I ignored the rule of lawyers, which is, never ask a question in a courtroom to which you don't already think you know the answer. And I turned to him and I said, Mr. Prime Minister, I have a sense that we're coming at an extraordinarily difficult time for your country. And as I was thinking about the situation here in your country, I was also thinking about the situation in Israel, which is a country that had roughly the same kinds of challenges and seems to have gone relatively well in managing them. Do you think it might be of interest to you, sir, if we could help encourage some of the Israelis sort of leading Israel through this economic crisis to talk to you and your cabinet members and to see how you might compare notes and perhaps learn from each other? No exaggeration. This exhausted man with sunken eyes, who hadn't shaved, whose body language could not have been more unfriendly, the kind of sitting back, arms here, almost tapping the table, started to lean forward, Bill, kind of coming closer to me from his position. And he said to me, "You think you could arrange that?" And I said, "We can certainly try. We think it might be great for both countries." No exaggeration. The meeting went on for 90 minutes. I thought we'd be out in 10 with a polite excuse. It went on for 90 minutes. It never touched any other issue, including some of the controversial issues about the peace process or settlements or Area C or whatever the issue of the day was at that moment. It ended very positively. And one of the messages we took from that meeting and meetings like it, Bell, was there's a whole vast agenda for Friends of Israel that has little to nothing to do with the conflict. Now, don't misunderstand me. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not trying to pretend the conflict doesn't exist, and I'm certainly not oblivious to the need to search for peace. As I said earlier, I have very personal stake in peace, not to mention an institutional or global stake in peace. Because if there is no peace, my grandchildren are going to be putting on a uniform and defending the state of Israel. And I, as a grandfather, am going to have a lot of sleepless nights. So it's very personal as well. But the other vast agenda is Israel is the quintessential 21st century problem solver. It has a lot to offer. And as one country after another kind of looks beyond the conflict, again, I'm not saying ignores the conflict, but compartmentalizes the conflict and says, okay, the conflict, we agree, we disagree, here are our thoughts, let's pursue them, and then we move. And we talk about the 21st century issues. What are they? Well, water, adequate food, cybersecurity, pandemics, climate change, radicalism, terrorism, go down the list. How many countries in the world have more experience than Israel? Practical experience, tested, proven experience than Israel. So I find that as an advocate, I'm ready, absolutely ready, eager to discuss the political issues of the day and the larger questions of pursuing peace. But that's no longer the bookends. The bookends have expanded because much as we all want peace, sadly, it's not going to come today or I fear tomorrow. So let's expand the agenda. And in the meantime, see what Israel can contribute to the world. We think, for example, that on the African continent, where climate change is ravaging so much of the continent, that there is an extraordinary amount that Israel can do above and beyond what it's already doing. And let's not let politics get in the way. Let's discuss politics here, agree where we agree, disagree where we, and let's move on and see what we can do together and how we can make the world a better place and how we can deepen relationships. That's the broader AJC agenda today.
Thank you, David. But since you're so eager to discuss the political issues, let's discuss them for a second.
Absolutely.
And then I want to go back to the Iran deal because I think there are some interesting parallels with what we're about to discuss. So obviously, current events, Israel has been in the news a lot lately regarding potential annexation of parts of the West Bank. Set the stage for us. We talk about annexation like everyone understands what that means. It's, as you know better than I do, it's very complicated. What does this mean? What is the background on this issue? Why is it so controversial and sparking such intense feelings both within the Jewish community and the wider world?
Sure, and we may have to extend this program another hour or two or three, if our audience has the patience to stay with us. I'll try and do it in a nutshell because there's already a lot out there, of course. The issue really arose now out of the Trump peace plan and what was an essential part of the peace plan, which was a sense that roughly 30% of the West Bank in any peace agreement would I'll say go to or stay with Israel, and roughly 70% would become the land formation of a Palestinian state. But from there, all the controversy broke out. The very word annexation itself, Bell, is a toxic word because annexation in our vocabulary is a very negative word. Russia annexed Crimea. After 1949, Jordan annexed the West Bank, the entire West Bank. Annexation is a hostile word, which is why some Israelis who support this prefer to use the extension of Israeli sovereign law. But at the end of the day, to the critics, it looks like annexation. So from AJC's perspective, again, mindful of what we said earlier, which is we're friends of Israel. We are independent in our thinking. We will offer our perspective, but at the end of the day, we recognize it's not our decision to make. It's Israel's decision to make. From our perspective at AJC, we see the costs of the annexation or extension of sovereignty. We see the costs as being very high. We don't see the benefits. There may be local benefits, political benefits within the sort of domestic, sort of Israeli space. We don't see the benefits. We see instead something that will be used as yet another excuse or pretext by the Palestinians to avoid the peace table. And here, so what I've just said is, from our perspective at AJC, we are opposed to what we're hearing based on our cost-benefit analysis. I want to be very clear. On the other hand, there is a separate discussion to be had, and one cannot be simply lumped into a different political category for saying what I'm about to say. Although in today's world, that's exactly the way some will try and play it. Because in today's world, you have a kind of binary political equation on just about everything, including this. You're either with us or you're against us. And the moment you try and introduce any other elements or nuance, then you're immediately in the opposition camp. That's not AJC, and we're not going to play along with that kind of sort of attempted intellectual intimidation. We're going to defend our space, which is to say no to unilateral steps on the West Bank, as are being discussed in our perspective. At the same time, it is fair to ask, how long will Israel have to wait for a credible, serious partner to sit across the table from Israel in the name of the Palestinian people and negotiate a permanent, comprehensive, enduring, end of conflict deal with Israel? Because the fact of the matter is, and it doesn't take away from the annexation discussion, Bill, but the fact of the matter is that from 1947 forward, that has not happened. It only happened once, Oslo, which culminated in 1993. But by May 10th, 1994, so about 8 months after the White House signing of Oslo, Yasser Arafat was in a mosque in Johannesburg. He thought he was speaking to the four walls and those within the four walls, and there were folks there who were recording him. And he said very clearly what many Israelis had feared. Oslo was a tactical decision, not a strategic decision. It was a tactical decision to get what you could, but the war would continue. Otherwise, and again, there are those, especially in your generation, because they don't remember previous governments, but newsflash, Benjamin Netanyahu has not been prime minister since 1948. Newsflash, Likud has not been in power since 1948. Governments of the left, governments of the center, governments of national unity, governments of the right have, over these last 73 years, I'll start in 1947, tried to find accommodation with the Palestinians periodically, and it hasn't happened. So I think even as we oppose the extension of sovereignty unilaterally as being another hurdle, big hurdle, to any peace process, we have to ask at the same time, when will the Palestinians show up? Seriously, credibly, perseverantly, to get this done. It won't be easy. It won't be easy. And as an advocate, I understand, Bill. And again, I hope that the folks will understand me. If this is to be done, ever, both sides have to win. There's a belief out there that says, no, that's wrong, David. One side has to be beaten into the ground, defeated, convinced that they have no alternative now but to live in perpetual defeat. I don't accept that. In the end, both sides are going to be asked to give up critical parts of their historical narrative. I believe that in many respects, Israel already has. In the early years, Israel did not accept the Palestinian nationalism as a sovereign expression. They thought it was part of a broader Arab nationalism. They didn't accept, certainly in the Likud party, the concept of a two-state agreement. now you see evolution. But have the Palestinians given up on their core narrative that Israel is an illegal, occupying state, a modern-day incarnation of the Crusaders, interlopers, that the Jews are not indigenous? And I remind us what Bill Clinton wrote in his autobiography when he spoke about his attempts just before he left office in 2000, 2001 to strike the deal with Arafat and Barak. And he wrote, and I urge the viewers to read it because I'm simply paraphrasing. Arafat said to Clinton, "You're a great man, Mr. President." And President Clinton said to him, "No, Chairman Arafat, I'm not a great man, and you're the reason why. Because you prevented peace from happening." And in that same meeting, Bell, Arafat again tried to persuade the president that the Jews had no historical claim to Jerusalem. Well, how can a peace partner ever be a credible peace partner if they can't even acknowledge that there's a second narrative here? Doesn't mean you have to buy it, lock, stock, and barrel, any more than Israel has to buy the Palestinian. But both sides have to make accommodation if they're going to look ahead. If not, they're going to be paralyzed by history. I think Israel has been ready to move on now for many, many years. So both sides have to win. Let's make the peace process simpler. Let's not build more hurdles to get there.
David, I want to follow up just with one question on this, which also to me is very personal, and I know it is for you. What happens if Israel does proceed? I mean, it's not about the hypothetical, but what happens when a major Jewish organization like AJC, filled with people who support AJC and other similar organizations, when we disagree with the democratically elected state of Israel? And how do we, as a pro-Israel advocate your whole life, what is your advice to those who are so Zionist and support Israel, but worry about coming into conflict, our values and actions we might see from the Israeli government? How would you frame that, and what would you say to those individuals who are struggling with this on the annexation issue or on other issues that come up?
I can speak about it from an AJC perspective, Bell, because look, there were times that we have disagreed with Israel. How could you not? I mean, I'm a proud American. Could I possibly say that in my lifetime I've agreed with every American government decision by each and every administration? Not even close. Has it changed my basic love of America, my pride in being an American? Not at all. The two can coexist. But what AJC has done, and I think it's understood, well understood in Israel, is when there's criticism, we try to find the most constructive way to channel the criticism. That means we're not playing to our bleachers. We're not trying to go to a group of donors and tell them, look at how muscular and macho we are and what we told the Israelis. We're not hoping that the New York Times or the Washington Post picks up on our opposition to this or that and turns it into a pull quote or a headline. We're operating from a principle that for us would be referred to as Ahavat Israel, a love of Israel. And the love for me as a parent didn't prevent me from telling my children from time to time, quite a bit actually, I don't like what you're doing, or this is not the way things should be said. But it comes from a place of love. I want to believe that my children understood from day one that even my critique was a caring, constructive, loving critique. That's where ours comes from that. It's not an effort to score points. It's not an effort to get attention. It's not an effort to get patted on the back by other groups in the United States that we hunger for their validation. Again, that explains our independence spell. So take the Iran issue. This is a really interesting one. And I know we don't have a lot of time, but here's one where the Israeli leadership, across the board, incumbent, opposition, came together as one and said, the Iran deal as proposed poses an existential threat to the state of Israel. to me, this was a defining moment in terms of how to read the American Jewish community, Bill. I'll leave aside the Congress and the White House, but since our conversation focuses right now on this, here, the Israeli leadership across the board at the very top said, the JCPOA as written poses an existential threat to the state of Israel. We agree on this. We disagree on everything else. We agree on this. The ideological organizations weren't prepared to follow along. So the left-wing groups here, even confronted with that fact, took recourse in their support for, in this case, the Obama administration. The assurances of the Obama administration that the Israeli concerns were misplaced and misguided. Did those groups even read the deal? It's hard for me to believe that many did, because if I recall, the deal came out on July 14th, 2015 from Vienna. That same day, there were already groups lining up to support the deal. And by the way, there were groups lining up to oppose the deal. So the groups that trusted President Obama lined up to support. And the groups that opposed President Obama lined up to oppose. Pretty simple. This is where AJC separated from the pack again. We took 23 days. We studied the deal. We actually read the deal. We circled around the deal. John Kerry, then Secretary of State, flew up, broken leg and all, to spend 90 minutes with the AJC leadership. Wendy Sherman, who negotiated the deal on behalf of the United States, came up separately for an hour and a half and spoke with us and answered our questions and made her points. And we spoke with others in Europe and, of course, in Israel from all sides. And after 23 days, we took a respectful position opposing the deal, while saying at the same time, we hope we're wrong. We hope we're wrong. So many in the Jewish community polarized according to their partisan politics. Some institutions in this country froze with internal sort of conflict. AJC was one of the organizations that came out very clearly. If it's a matter of existential importance to the state of Israel, and if we read the deal and speak to the people and share the concerns, we have an obligation to speak up and speak out. And it doesn't matter whether where we are on the political spectrum. As it happens, we're centrist, we're independent. And that's where I seriously parted company with the dogmatists and the ideologues who couldn't get out from under the uniform that they wear every day.
Thank you, David. I mean, I think it's a very interesting parallel of different issues that are happening with the Iran deal and some things that are happening now. And also just the consistency in the approach, I think, is important and refreshing. I want to turn it over quickly to Jillian, who's going to sneak in a few audience questions before we have to wrap up.
Thank you, Bill.
Okay.
We'll try and fit in 2 questions here, and apologies to the rest of the viewers whose questions we don't get to. The first one comes from Michael Brenner in New York. This week, I've been thinking a lot about the Blaustein-Ben Gurion Agreement, which defined the relationship between American Jewry and Israel as one of mutual support, but also mutual non-intervention in one another's internal politics. Does the Blaustein Agreement still guide AJC's thinking? And if so, how do we adapt in a world in which Israeli leaders might intervene in US politics and American Jewish leaders on both ends of the political spectrum increasingly feel empowered to intervene in Israel's?
Thank you, Michael Brenner. It's a great question. I wish I had lots of time to answer it. I will answer it only in this way for now, Michael. It was a very important agreement when it was reached some close to 70 years ago. It needs to be revisited. A lot has happened on both sides of the ocean over these last nearly 70 years. We need to see whether we collectively can write a new Blaustein-Ben Gurion agreement that reflects the times in which we live, which are dramatically different than they were in the early 1950s.
Thank you. We've gotten a lot of questions on the US-Israel relationship, including Eileen Markowitz in Seattle, who says support for Israel in the US for a long time was bipartisan and not questioned. In recent years, this dynamic has been challenged and Israel has used, as discussed by both parties, as a wedge issue. What is your assessment of the current US-Israel relationship, and where do we go from here? What about the members of Congress looking to reduce aid to Israel if they do move into the West Bank? How will AJC respond?
Thank you for that question, Eileen. Look, I think the good news is that there remains overwhelming bipartisan support for the US-Israel relationship. At the same time, it's obvious, and your question certainly suggested, Eileen, that we have our work to do with new generations of people that have no history, no perspective of the history of this relationship that goes back to President Harry Truman and his momentous decision on May 14th, 1948, and what has ensued since then. So there's a lot of work to be done in terms of education, and I would stress, mindful of the minefields and the pitfalls here, the education is not just about the history, important though that is. The education is about the importance of Israel to the United States. Elected officials here in this country are elected to represent the best interests of the United States as they see them. And I would argue that any elected official, including the newest members who are going to be heading for Congress in early January, in the new class, if you will, of Congress, that they need to understand what many of them may not really understand right now because they don't have access to the information. The relationship with Israel is not a gift to Israel. The relationship with Israel represents both the highest values and the highest interests of two countries. The United States derives enormous benefits, often unsung and even unknown to many, from the relationship with Israel. And this country, irrespective of what administration is in power, needs a reliable, dependable, tested, democratic ally and partner in that part of the world. And Israel fits the bill. So we got a lot of work to do. I fully understand it. As far as the last part of your question, Eileen, AJC stands with in this case, since you spoke about Democrats, with Vice President Biden, with Senator Ben Cardin, with Senator Chuck Schumer, and others who have said, whatever our views may be on an Israeli decision regarding extension of sovereignty / annexation, that should be separate and apart from the US-Israel military relationship. We're keeping them apart. We're not tying the two together, as a very few members of Congress, very few, would like to see happen.
David, I'm going to chime in here just because we're quickly running out of time. First of all, I think you wanted to say something before we jump to questions. I wanted to give you a chance to finish your thought. And also, I'm seeing that.
Go ahead. I'll wrap it into whatever question you ask. I'll answer it.
Okay, I'm seeing a lot of people sending in questions had a similar question to what I was going to ask you to end, which hopefully is more positive, and that is, what is next in terms of your thinking and AJC's thinking, and perhaps on Israel's mind in terms of the front line of pro-Israel advocacy? What is the next frontier?
Right. So the point I wanted to slip in before Bell, which sort of stand on its own, is one of the problems that I think we have in the world today, and it doesn't just relate to pro-Israel advocacy, it relates to just about anything, is the 6-letter word nuance has gone out the window. This scares me as an American. This scares me as a parent. This scares me as a grandparent. This scares me as an advocate. If we're really sort of entering into a binary world with sort of two opposing orthodoxies and no room for conversation in between, you're either with us or you're against us. For me, intellectually, that's a very frightening world. AJC has always tried to introduce nuance into our conversation about the US-Israel relationship, about Israel's place in the world. It's a nuance that comes from a love of Israel, but nonetheless, it's a nuance. And I saw, for example, last week when we tried to introduce some nuance into one of the topical issues of the day, the anti-nuance crowd jumped on us, tried to mischaracterize our position, tried to, in a way, bully us. They were not going to succeed. But I come from a place of, I earned my stripes in the Soviet Jewry movement. I come from a place of Jewish unity, not Jewish disunity. Sure, there were disagreements in the Soviet Jewry movement, but you know what? We were all united in purpose, and the disagreements were minimal. When you stop to think about Natan Sharansky sitting in solitary confinement for 9 years, our differences were, as they say in Yiddish, Norishkeit. They were meaningless. I wish we could preserve some measure of that unity, and even in the disunity, exercise a bit more civility. We all, I suspect, most of us certainly, want the same thing. We want genuine, enduring peace. And there are different pathways to get there, and no one has all of the monopoly on wisdom, as I said earlier. The future, I think I said it earlier in a way, Bill. Traveling the world, Israel is easier and easier to understand from the perspective of the 21st century. When countries consider the challenges they face in cybersecurity, Israel is one of the 5 cybersecurity leaders in the world. When they talk about artificial intelligence, they look to Israel. When they talk about driverless cars, they look to Israel. When they look for vaccines for COVID-19, they look to Israel. When they try and figure out how water-starved countries can become green and fertile, they look to Israel. That's the Israel that has to emerge. And the more it emerges, I think the more countries are lining up in order to gain access. Israel has an enormous role to play in steering the world through the 21st century. I hope it won't carry the burden of the conflict throughout the century. I yearn for peace. I take seriously Isaiah and his quest for peace, the prophet Isaiah. But at the same time, other things are happening. I just want to end, Bill, because I know we're at the witching hour. If people really want to understand Israel, here's one way that I understood Israel. I went in 1984 to Ethiopia to, in a very quiet way, participate in the rescue of Jews from Ethiopia. I've never really discussed that role, and I'll just touch on the surface, because for 36 years I had not publicly revealed the details. But because I had access to information about a neighboring country to Ethiopia, it was helpful to Israel in planning what is one of the most remarkable moments in Jewish and modern Israeli history. And that was the rescue of Ethiopian Jews. And as one leader of the civil rights movement in the United States said at the time, I think I'm quoting him correctly, this was the first time Africans were brought out of the continent on planes to freedom and not in chains to slavery. Those Jews in Ethiopia had believed for some 2,000 years from the time of Solomon and Sheba that they were the only Jews on the planet. But their prayers were always to Zion, and Yerushalayim, without knowing that Zion and Jerusalem had been reconstituted in 1948. When I saw the lengths to which Israel went to rescue those Ethiopian Jews by the thousands and tens of thousands, I understood again the miracle of Israel. And my plea to the viewers is, whatever your views may be on this issue or that issue or this personality or that personality, please, please, please do not lose sight of the bigger picture of the extraordinary rebirth of Jewish sovereignty and what it has meant for Jews in Ethiopia, for Jews in the Soviet and now former Soviet Union, for the hostages in Entebbe. I can keep going. It's a much bigger story, and I hope we can find enough space in our file on Israel to have our political concerns if they exist, but also to have this sense of wonder and gratitude that on our watch, in our lifetime, after nearly 75 generations, we get to say this year in Jerusalem.
Thank you so much, David. What a beautiful way to end. And as always, you're able to articulate what I think so many of us are feeling and wrestle with and struggle with, but aren't necessarily able to express in the very clear and candid and coherent manner that you always do. So really thank you for that. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Jillian to close us out.
Thank you. And thank you both for such a powerful conversation. I also want to thank our audience for joining us and showing your commitment to the topic discussed today. In these unique times, while so many of us are separated from our family and friends, AJC is still bringing us together on the issues that matter. Please consider making a donation to AJC so we can offer you more programs like this one and so we can continue standing up for Israel here in America and around the world. Visit ajc.org/donate. Please join us for our next Advocacy Anywhere program, Inside Vatican Diplomacy, Anti-Semitism, Israel, and the Middle East, featuring Archbishop Paul Gallagher and AJC Director of International Interreligious Affairs, David Rosen. This program will take place on Monday, July 6th at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. To register for this program and to stay up to date on all Advocacy Anywhere programs, please visit ajc.org/advocacyanywhere. Please stay safe and healthy. Thank you. Goodbye.